Hello, hi. This is Dom, and he's going to talk to us about Dash, which is a library for interactive data visualization on web apps without JavaScript. Please give a warm welcome to Dom.
Hello, hi, can everyone hear me at the back? Okay, good stuff. It's a sign of a good conference. I've actually started to lose my voice, so if I go a bit croaky halfway through this, I'm very sorry. And so, yeah, like we said before, this is my talk. We're giving, so we're going over Dash today, which is a Python framework from Botley, which allows you to produce interactive web pages, but without having to use JavaScript. So, sorry, I'm going to have to flip back and forth because I haven't got my clicker, so apologies there. And the other alternative title for this presentation is what you can, can't, should, and also probably shouldn't do with Botley. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Clicker, thank you. Problem solved. How does this work?
You open the lid and it has a USB.
Okay. Perfect. Sorry. One moment. Okay. Should and shouldn't do.
On button on the side.
Oh, button? On button. That always helps, doesn't it? Yeah, okay, there we go. What you should and shouldn't do with JavaScript. Okay. This is. No, okay, it's a reveal JS error. Sorry, we're back to where we're. Okay, so yeah, the rest of this talk, I'll give a kind of a brief introduction into Dash, what it is and how it works. And also then discuss kind of what we've learned at decisionLab, the company I work for, from using Dash at work. And in particular, we're looking for kind of feedback and any questions that you might have towards the end as well. And so we want to discuss some kind of like best practice and so on that we've kind of developed using Dash. I should say as well, the slides for this talk are online, and there's also a GitHub repository as well, which has a lot of it has several code examples in it. So it's just bit.ly, bit.ly, /PyCon UK-2019, and that's all lowercase. Okay, and also finally, if you're viewing these slides on the web, whenever you see that kind of down emoji, just push the down button rather than go to the right-hand side. Okay, so I should say as well, I'm not an author on the Dash project, I'm not necessarily a Dash expert. This is more of a talk about using Dash at work, as opposed to actually kind of a full introduction to the framework. So if anything is out of date and there happens to be someone from Botley here, then please don't shoot me. Please just kind of offer some support and guidance. So first off, why am I here? I'm a full-stack JavaScript Python developer. I work in JavaScript just as much as I work in the back-end or in databases and in Python. And so it might seem a little bit odd that I'm using a Python introductory framework to write JavaScript. So the reason why I do that is because I work for these guys, decisionLab. We're a mathematical modelling consultancy based in Vauxhall in central London. And it would be remiss of me to say, not to say that we are hiring. So if you do want to come and work with us, we work mostly in infrastructure, we work mostly in defence, intelligence, infrastructure, and like large engineering. We use mathematical models to build tools for our clients. And so we don't just write a report, we generally tend to produce often like a Python application or some kind of basic kind of proof of concept that demonstrates how our model works and allows it to be used inside of a business or inside of a large organisation, like a Navy or something like that. And so we kind of, one of the problems that we have, or not a problem, but something that we often find amongst our team, is that there are kind of two cultures to Python, and I think that everyone will kind of recognise that here. There's that kind of Python sort of software side of working as a developer, and then there's that kind of Python data side. And these people might have different backgrounds or just different interests. Perhaps the software engineer might be more interested in databases and sort of building large tools, whereas a data scientist is really interested in the latest neural network technique or something like that. And so the kind of collaboration between these sort of cultures and camps is really important, and that's exactly why everyone's here today, I think, really. But it can also be very time-consuming on small projects. So, for example, if I want to make a proof of concept app, I don't want necessarily to have to get a JavaScript engineer on my team, and then for a small project, that's going to be very time-consuming. And so what I want to do is kind of minimize the new technologies that are needed for a data scientist to begin working on a project and get something off the ground. Which is because their background probably isn't in any kind of web development and so on. So I'm really facilitating the work of data scientists. So just to kind of explain this very succinctly in a tweet, and I loved this a while ago, I saw it, in case you can't see it. So there's a guy there, sort of maths genius in front of a huge whiteboard, and it says Mark was almost ready to implement his Hello World React app. And it's, I mean, they're saying that's partly unfair on React, but React does have a reputation amongst some for being kind of overly complicated, or it's a very different style of coding to get used to if you're coming from Python, perhaps. And so we found Dash, or it wasn't me actually, it was one of our data scientists at the time. It's an open source project, although it does have a lot of paid consultancy options as well. And it's quite established now, but it still describes itself as an experimental project, partly because of how fast JavaScript changes. I mean, perhaps JavaScript is an experimental language. Yeah, it recently hit version 1.0, and that was in, I think, June. So, and you can see their website here. They say that not only can you build not only can you build web analytic apps without JavaScript, you can do that at scale, and that'll be beautiful as well. So this is the real appeal of JavaScript, of Dash, sorry. There's no JavaScript that you have to learn. And apparently that's a good thing, but we'll see later on, perhaps that's not always a good thing. And so just for the remainder of the talk, we'll introduce a bit more about how Dash works and give a kind of hello world example. We'll give some examples of how you can start to visualize data and kind of get apps running really quickly with kind of minimal sort of code and overhead. We'll discuss some of the kind of good practices, and then also some of the areas that we're taking Dash into. And then we'll also discuss maybe when you stop using Dash and start to build a different kind of application. And likewise, I'm afraid there will be some kind of code up on this screen here, and so rather than squint your eyes necessarily, the GitHub repository, which was mentioned at the start, and I'll put up, I'll tweet about and then put on the pre-talk site at the end, has all the examples in. But if you go to github.com/Weldon, D-O-M, Weldon, W-E-L-D-O-N, and you'll find the repository there with a lot of code. So first off, how does Dash work? And I think obviously we'll give a quick hello world example. So you can install it using pip, and then just pip install Dash. And then this here is a minimal hello world example. So what we do is we create an app, just like you would create an app in, say, Flask or something. Actually under the hood, it creates a Flask app for you. You define a layout on your application here, which in this case is just this div tag, so that's a division in HTML. And then I've put one other tag inside of my div, which says hello Cardiff. It's a heading 1, so a big header. And then at just the end, I run my app. So that's now created I now have to obviously run it in the console and so on. That's now created an application that's living on my laptop. And so you can see here, I've just created a very simple hello world Dash application using Python with just a couple of lines of code. If you actually clone that repository as well, and there's a Docker compose file, and if you just run Docker up, all of the links in these slides will just point to the relevant examples as well. So that's hello world. And so just to discuss what's going on there, there are several packages involved in Dash. One of them is Dash HTML components, and that's really just a Python wrapper around React. It uses Python to create a very basic React application dynamically, which is then sent to a browser. And then the package named Dash, or just Dash on its own, essentially manages the relationships between those individual components and then sets up a Flask server which allows you to create interactive web pages rather than just static React files. But as I said in the title, we want interactive web pages. We don't just want a single static file or a single page that has a little bit of text on it. And we actually want to make something that's kind of dynamic. So before we discuss how to do that in Dash, I'm going to we're going to explore how would that work ordinarily in JavaScript and what kind of HTML do we need. And so if we take a look at this example, sorry. It's, I'm never going to forget my clicker again. So yeah, I'm terribly sorry about the colouring on this, but you can see in order to do this in standard HTML, we would need three things. So first off, we have a single text tag or a paragraph, and that just contains the word hello. And there's a child inside there, and we have another span tag, and we're going to put someone's name in there. And then we've got an input tag as well, where we're going to ask a person for their name. So we're going to say, what's the person's name? And we're going to put it into where it says there at the moment. So we're going to say hello to someone. We need to ask their name, and we need to have somewhere to put their name when we've asked it. And so in the web browser and in web development, fundamentally, we have something called the DOM, and that's the document object model. It's not something I've named after myself for vanity purposes. Although I do often get asked that at JavaScript conferences. And so we have a paragraph node here, a child with a paragraph node called span with an ID, which is indicated by that hashtag, and then that input again with an ID that's indicated by that hashtag. And so we need to now use JavaScript. We need a script which sets the value of that span to the value that we get, that the user's typed into that input tag there. And then crucially monitors it for changes, so that it doesn't just happen once. We don't just set it when it loads. It has to continually monitor it. So every single time that a user changes what goes in that text box, it updates what goes into that paragraph tag. Now, JavaScript is a language that just simply allows us to manipulate the DOM, which sounds weirder than when it's actually your name. But, so we use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, and React is a JavaScript library that allows us to do that declaratively. So rather than having to write tons of code ourselves to say, I'll monitor this text tag, and then as soon as it changes, do this, we just define how we want our application to work, and React kind of sorts out the rest for us. And the syntax isn't important here, but the important thing is that when we're going to be saying hello someone, that kind of string interpolation, or that sort of, the thing that says puts someone inside of hello, is done in JavaScript. It's a JavaScript function that would look something a little bit like this. Now, in Dash, however, we have a separate concept which is similar but different. So interaction inside of Dash is managed through something called callbacks. And you can think of these as being a little bit like Excel functions, in that every single time the input to a callback changes, that function is re-executed. And so, for example, here we'd have our input tag, and so as soon we'd have our text input, and as soon as the value of that text input changes, because that's an input to some callback we've created, that callback's going to run, and it's going to return hello or hello whatever we want. Okay, so our updated hello world. This time again, we just define that layout that we had before, and this time inside of Dash. You can see here I've put my heading there, I've given it an ID. I've also put that input in there using Dash core components, which is another package from Dash. And then I'm terribly sorry about the size of this font, but you can see here that, well, essentially we've got a function and there's a decorator that you get from Dash, and you're allowed, you use that decorator to say the input to this callback will be these particular values. So in our case, it's the value of our input field, and the output is going to be the contents of my header1 tag. And as you can see here, I've just got a very, very simple one-line Python function, and it's just got an F string in it, and it says hello, whatever the name that we get from that particular input is. And so, when we run our application, you can see it live. So we've just created, again, we've just kind of spun up this React application. So I've said, hello, Cardiff here. And now if I was to change this, I could say, hello, PyCon. And now we have an interactive web application with literally just trivial amounts of Python code. It's 3 or 4 lines, just happens to be split over several using rack. So, now the important distinction to remember here is that whereas before we had that JavaScript function that was acting as our kind of string interpolator, or thing that said how we want our application to behave, that function is now written in Python. And because our Python is run on the server, it means that every time the value inside of that input field changes, it involves a call back to the server, and then something has to happen on the server, and it has to send a response so that Dash knows how to update that page. Now, React is blazingly fast at doing that because it has an algorithm called Fiber, and it sorts all of this out inside of a user's browser. Whereas if we're constantly making requests back and forth to the server, we have a huge performance loss because we have to cross a network, there's tons more technology involved, and it's just a much more complicated kind of setup. But generally, that's okay because I'm using Dash to create a proof of concept or an alpha that's not going to have many users, or something that's it's not going to be production quality, huge numbers of users at all. So generally, that's okay, but it's something to be aware of as your application might start to scale. And so just to give a kind of tour of the things that you can do in Dash, as we said before, it's mostly geared towards creating dashboards and interactive kind of data visualizations. And you can add more kind of transactional features as well, which we'll come to in just a second. And so the first one, for example, say you've got a data frame and you want to display that to your users. Well, I've taken the Titanic data set, if anyone's familiar with that. It has all of the passengers on the Titanic and their kind of status and so on. So I've taken that and literally just, you can see the full code example there on GitHub, but I've used something called a Dash data table, which is essentially a table that allows you to display data frames. And then using just a couple of lines of code, you can see here we've got our full data set that's just been listed, and literally all I've done here is just kind of fed my pandas data frame to a Dash data table, and all of a sudden I have a full listing of all of the passengers on the Titanic. And because I also put a drop-down menu in there, I can use the input of that drop-down menu to create a callback, which is then going to filter which passengers get displayed. So I've done this based on sex, and so now you can see if I want to display all female passengers, Dash will update that for me, and likewise I can do that for any particular property. It's literally just a single line of Python that I've used to create that kind of interactivity there. And do take a look at that GitHub repository to kind of see that in some more detail. Likewise as well, this project has come from Plotly, the people who do the plotting library. And so, unsurprisingly, it has very good support for creating graphs as well. I'm really terribly sorry as well about the size of the screen here, but I've literally just very similar. There's a function signature here, which is very similar to the kind of Plotly standard graph. And I've put some data in here, and this time I've listed the number of passengers on the Titanic by the first letter of their first name. And you can see a live example of that as well in this repository. And interestingly enough, apparently the most common letter for for a Titanic passenger's name to start with was J. And so you can see, you can visualize all of that using minimal amounts of code, very simply just using Dash. Okay. I also said that you can get some kind of transactional web applications using Dash, so not just interactive, but also transactional. And by that I kind of mean you're able to make applications which change something. So, for example, if you wanted to maintain a database and then have your users add something to that database or make a query to that database, you can do that using Dash as well. Terribly sorry about these code links, but sorry, on a larger screen it's a bit bigger. But essentially, the thing to take home is if you look at that GitHub repository as an example of how you can do that, and a way that you can do that using something called state inside of Dash. So before we said that as soon as an input changes to so we've got a callback that makes the web page interactive. As soon as an input changes, you run that callback again, and you can access other parts of the DOM using that state. And so that's something to check the documentation for, I think. But if you want to see a live example of that, for example, here you can create a really simple to-do list app using Dash with minimal amounts of code, and I could just do that. And then all of a sudden I've created an interactive web page that allows me to store data somewhere using just a couple of lines of Python. So just to move on, Dash also allows you to build your own Dash components. So these are JavaScript components that you build and that you make, which essentially you're able to code in JavaScript and then provide to your team for them to use. I should say as well, though, that unfortunately Dash, the API that it provides, is quite limiting. And so unfortunately, once you're able to create some applications, you are limited from accessing certain JavaScript functions or JavaScript features particularly things like Redux and kind of more complex APIs. That means that some of the application components that you might want to build, you won't necessarily be able to because of the API that's provided currently in some of the latest versions of Dash. But that does obviously continually change. That being said, you can still go very far with Dash and create quite interesting or feature-rich applications. And so one of the kind of more experimental kind of applications that we created at decisionLab quite recently was a tool that allowed users or military users in Colombia to detect illegal gold mining activity in the Amazon rainforest using a web application. And that was all created by a couple of data scientists using Dash with kind of minimal involvement from our JavaScript team. And so you can see something that kind of looks like this that allows you to explore satellite. This used a machine learning model to interrogate large amounts of satellite data. You can see that we did that fully using Dash. We've got charts, maps, and all sorts of other interactive components. And this is all done using plain old Python with no JavaScript involved. Apart from that one map component which we built and we're looking to open source as a Dash component quite shortly. And so, just to kind of come to sort of like evaluating Dash and how to get the most out of it, there are a couple of lessons that we've learned at decisionLab that we can kind of share. And there's four particular kind of take-home messages that I would say if you're starting to build a more complicated application using Dash, or people on your team are. And the first one might sound very basic, is to organize your app and to actually think about the file structure and how you can separate out concerns. The second one is to build it using factory functions and implement some kind of routing or navigation as well. And then the final one is to think about how you can start to tool up Dash to allow your team to go further. And the tool that the kind of feature that we've developed first at decisionLab is dependency injection. Now, because of time, I won't be able to cover all of those, I'm afraid, but the most important one, like I said, is organize your application, because if you're working in a team that you might have some people who maybe have just finished their master's or PhD and kind of coming to building things for the first time. Because obviously, well, like any kind of software project, everyone's always checking the documentation, especially on a particularly novel project. I found that because all of the documentation for Dash tends to be in a single file, often we can get very, very large, almost like 2,000 line single application Dash files. And so the most important thing is to start kind of splitting that up and kind of inculcating that into your team, thinking about how can you get people to start separating out concerns early on rather than later. And so that might seem like very basic advice, but it's important to sort of think about what kind of file structure you might use. And so the most important thing I would suggest is to separate your callbacks from your layouts in Dash. And so that's the kind of the actual layout and description of how a page should look. Separate that from how is it interactive and what kind of bits talk to what. Okay. And so there's an example of that in that repository. And finally, this is the slightly more kind of complicated sort of, if you've got a team of software engineers who want to start building into Dash, I would suggest that you start building your application using factory functions. And so that means that rather than simply declaring your application in one file, write a function that makes your application, that actually kind of builds your application up whenever you need it. Because that's important for things like testing, and it's also important for making your app reusable and then thinking about how you can Dockerize it properly and so on. This also allows you to start thinking about making routing and navigation much, much easier. Because we've developed a system at decisionLab, and there's parts of it in the example repository that I've put online. We've abstracted all of our callbacks, all of our code which defines a callback or a layout. We've actually abstracted that from Dash, and so we now have our own specialist class, which allows a user to declaratively, using decorators in a very similar syntax, declare their application's callbacks, their application's layouts, and so on. And then we have a tool which just allows us to take, say, several different modules from various different code bases and combine them into one application on the hoof. So, and so we build a default template we build a default template that allows us to essentially make all of our components interactive, reusable, kind of interchangeable across lots and lots of different projects. So, just to give an example of what that looks like, for example, I created this before, so I've copied my to-do list component before that I showed you and created something called a shopping list. And so you can see now that just because we've declared those separately using separate decorators, we now have a to-do list and, say, a shopping list, and all of that kind of navigation and routing and context management can be done automatically. And like I said before, we're looking at tooling up Dash much further, putting dependency injection into it and so on. And the final point here that I kind of want to sort of stress is you need to think about when to stop using Dash and when to start building a proper, in inverted colons, kind of web application. Because, finally, Dash is really great for rapid UI development, where you want to allow people to non-specialists in web development to make interactive web pages very, very quickly. And it's informed web development as well. So the people who do the data science that makes the interface that your end users are going to use can actually start making and building that interface. It doesn't have to go through a third party. But the two kind of flaws to that are it's great for rapid UI development, but also at the same time, ask yourself if you're doing a bigger project with Dash, are you creating a lot of technical debt? Like, if you know that eventually your application is going to require lots of JavaScript engineers, why are you building it in Python in the first place? And you should maybe think about if this is going to scale, perhaps we should get some of those skills in early on in the project and get those people involved in early discussions. And finally, it's informed UI development, but who's it informed by? I mean, do you have user researchers? Have you got UX consultants? Perhaps you need these people in that project much earlier on, rather than somebody creating an application straight away. Also, we haven't mentioned authentication or testing or various other things that aren't necessarily great for JavaScript. So, the take-home message is that Dash is great for rapid UI development. It's worth investing a bit of time into to make your team go further. But ultimately, front-end engineers will still have a job in 3 years' time. So, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. That was really great. I look forward to have a detailed look on Dash myself. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions. However, Don, will you be available?
I'll be.
He will be available, so please feel free to talk to him and ask him all the relevant questions. Thank you.